We couldn't afford to buy a computer kit on the market. So we liberated some parts from Hewlett-Packard and Atari and worked on a design for about 6 months and decided that we would build our own computer. So we built them.
Apple is the most valuable company in the world and has a role in our lives like no other. However, its journey to the top has been full of incredible highs and some of the lowest lows.
Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag.
This is iMac. And we are calling it iPhone.
To report, unfortunately, that Apple is confirming that Steve Jobs has passed away after a battle with pancreatic cancer.
The tech giant is facing multiple lawsuits after it admitted that it slows down older models.
The antitrust regulator for the EU said Ireland had given Apple a sweetheart tax deal for well over a decade.
An exhausted workforce, people sleeping on their breaks, others falling asleep as they work.
Today, we're excited to extend our services even further.
Now to a major milestone, Apple becoming the first publicly traded company in the world to hit $1 trillion in net worth.
And that is a $2 trillion milestone. Apple's market cap crossing that incredible level for the first time today.
Apple was founded by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in 1976 and began as a company targeting hobbyists with basic kit computers. What started as a pipe dream in a California garage quickly grew into a behemoth of the technology world, and in 1984, they debuted Macintosh.
We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
This advert would become a watershed moment in the history of the company and change the idea of what home computers could be. Apple enjoyed huge success, and when they went public on the stock market, Jobs and Wozniak were both made millionaires instantly. When Macintosh sales dipped, however, Steve Jobs would attempt to oust the CEO John Sculley, and the ensuing power struggle would lead to Jobs being forced out of the company that he had founded.
Stephen Jobs figures heroically in the history of American entrepreneurship. At the age of 22, he founded a company called Apple Computer and proceeded to grow it into a $2 billion business. In the spring of 1985, he lost a power struggle inside Apple and left the company he had created.
Although the company did have some successes from that period on and innovated in a number of areas, it's difficult to view that period when Steve Jobs was absent from the company as particularly successful. They went through a large number of executives, and ultimately, just before Steve Jobs returned to the company, they were on the verge of bankruptcy.
Apple had been hemorrhaging money and was not able to compete with Microsoft. The 1990s were the decade of the Windows PC, and it was inconceivable that anyone would buy a Mac at that time.
What was interesting for Steve Jobs was that he then started Next Computing, where he built a whole computing company which was extremely profitable, which was then acquired by Apple for almost $500 million. As a result, Steve Jobs returns back into Apple.
When he came back, it was like a reinforcement, like a big reinforcement. And he felt entitled to do his thing, to redefine the company the way he thought the company should be in the very beginning. So the company regained this idea of, I don't need to look to what other companies do. I don't even need to look at the customers. I'm going to tell the customers what to do. And this takes a lot of guts.
Steve Jobs' return brought huge changes. Product lines were cut down, and visionary designer Johnny Ive was brought on to set Apple's design philosophy. The launch of the iMac in 1998 would become the blueprint for Apple's products for years to come.
Well, today, I'm incredibly pleased to introduce iMac, our consumer product.
If you think about the iMac that first came with Steve Jobs, he brought color to computing. Actual colorful looking designs on a computer was something that people hadn't really seen before. Suddenly, a computer was something that would look good and would actually look nice in a living room rather than just buried in a bedroom.
Apple was on a roll and capturing the public's attention in a way consumer electronics had never been able to before. In 2001, they launched the iPod. It may not have been the first MP3 player of its kind, but it redefined the market. Suddenly, listening to music was trendy and sexy, and Apple went from strength to strength. Arguably the single biggest moment in Apple's history, however, came on a crisp January day in San Francisco in 2007.
So, 3 things: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. And here it is.
To this day, over 1 billion iPhones have been sold worldwide, and Steve Jobs and Apple have undeniably changed the world we live in. The technology that they have popularized has revolutionized the modern age and reshaped our relationships with each other and our environment. From smartphones to smartwatches, earbuds to computers, millions of lives today are enhanced and affected by Apple products.
It's difficult to look at Apple and all that it has achieved and say that it has not left the world better than it found it.
At this hour, Steve Jobs, the CEO of the iconic Apple Incorporated, has announced he has resigned. We've just gotten a hold of his letter of resignation, and I want to read that to you at this time. It says, "I've always said that if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come. I hereby resign as CEO of Apple."
Steve Jobs' resignation was a shock to the world and left huge shoes to fill. The visionary leader who had steered Apple's design and marketing strategy for so long was no longer at the helm.
There may be this fear that, Apple is going to implode. That's not even close to being true. This is one of the most well-run companies in the world, with one of the deepest benches, with one of the largest cash reserves. And if anything, I actually expect Apple to be a stronger company going forward, not weaker.
I think Apple's kind of built their client base and their cult of Apple, shall we say, and I don't think that it's going to do too much.
Apple's excellent PR machine ensured that the public were never aware of what was going on behind the scenes. But Jobs' resignation was a sign of his losing battle with cancer, and just 6 weeks later, news broke that shook the world.
Steve Jobs, co-founder of Apple and the most successful businessman of his era, dies age 56.
To report, unfortunately, that Apple is confirming that Steve Jobs has passed away after a battle with pancreatic cancer.
Steve Jobs, a rebel and icon, dead at 56, father of 4, inventor of the Apple computer, inventor of the iPhone, the iPod, and the iPad, one of America's foremost business executives, a master retailer, a master inventor, a demanding boss, has died, succumbing to liver cancer and pancreatic cancer.
Just minutes ago, Apple's board of directors issued a statement saying, in part, Steve's brilliance, passion, and energy were the source of countless innovations that enrich and improve all of our lives. The world is immeasurably better because of Steve.
Steve Jobs' death marked the end of an era. Apple was his life's work, and countless questions surrounded the future of the company. Before he died, Jobs wanted to protect his legacy, and so he hand-picked his replacement, Tim Cook.
Good morning. Good morning. This is my first product launch since being named CEO. I'm sure you didn't know that.
Tim Cook and Steve Jobs have very different backgrounds. If Steve Jobs is a product person, someone that is obsessed with the minor details of each and every device, Tim Cook is an operational person. He is a person that understands supply chains and management. And so understandably, that does lead to a slightly different approach.
I think the big difference when Tim Cook took over was that, well, after all, he's an engineer. He's a very passionate engineer with a lot of knowledge of the personality of the company, etc. But the way they manage their relationship with suppliers, the whole value chain, etc., is far more, let's say, professionalized. You need to turn Apple into a very well-oiled machine that can deliver. That's fundamental.
When Tim Cook took over, there was a seismic shift at Apple. From an idealistic company that saw itself as a David to the Goliaths of the tech industry, they became a ruthless machine with profit margins at their heart. In 2010, experts began to notice a worrying change in Apple's financial reports. They had suddenly stopped making all of their money in the U.S.
And we turn to a side of the tech revolution that rarely gets attention. How much do our leading tech companies pay in taxes?
Apple could be about to feel the wrath of the European Commission, which is set to accuse the US tech giant of benefiting from illegal Irish tax deals.
It turns out good old Apple might owe Italy around, €1 billion in back taxes.
This shift prompted both EU and US Senate to launch detailed investigations into what Apple had done. And it was these investigations that indicated to the public that Apple may have sidestepped the law in its quest to maximize profits.
You swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do, so help me God.
Since 1980, Apple has had an R&D cost-sharing agreement with our Irish subsidiaries. Our cost-sharing agreement, which is common in the industry, is audited by the IRS, and we are in full compliance with all laws and regulations.
This agreement shifted the economic rights in your crown jewels to 3 Irish companies that you own and control. And so $100 billion plus is now stashed away in these 3 Irish companies. I'm not saying it was legal or illegal. You've told us in one place, I believe, Mr. Cook, that you do not intend to bring those monies home unless our tax rates...
Senator, there's a lot there. I'd appreciate being able to...
You can, but I just want to ask you that one question. Is it true you told our staff you're not bringing the $100 billion home unless we reduce our tax rates? Is that accurate?
I don't remember saying that.
Is it true?
I said I don't remember saying.
No, I'm saying, is it true that you're not going to bring them home unless we reduce our tax rates?
I have no current plan to do so at the current tax rates.
Okay. With that, we're going to move to our third panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It was a sham. It was purely an accounting maneuver, but it was an accounting maneuver that allowed Apple to take profits that were properly attributable to the U.S. and just move them to Ireland. The reason that was helpful to them is that Apple had made a sweetheart deal with the government of Ireland to get an especially low tax rate, where they'd pay tax rates of 1% or even less.
Ireland a tax haven?
Yeah, I think by any meaningful definition of the term, it is. The government will tell you that technically it's not. But if you have any meaningful definition, i.e. a country which facilitates aggressive tax avoidance by big multinationals such that they end up paying tiny amounts, virtually no tax on their enormous profits, then we are a tax haven.
Apple had been shifting billions of dollars of profits to Ireland and paying little to no tax thanks to their sweetheart deal. But the EU ruled that this deal was in fact illegal state aid, and they dealt severe repercussions.
The European Commission has today adopted a decision that Apple's tax benefits in Ireland are illegal. Apple now have to repay the benefits worth up to 13 billion euros plus interest.
These companies would say they're doing everything they can within the bounds of the law. Our tax laws are the way they are almost entirely because of a relentless lobbying effort by companies like Apple. Some of these laws have been essentially written by the companies themselves. Like, they'll give the statutory language to members of Congress and say, this is what we'd like. Companies like Apple have special access to Congress, have special access to the process of changing laws. That doesn't make them above the law, but it does mean that they have the capacity to effectively change the laws in ways that they like. And that is profoundly disturbing. Really what it means when $47 billion of tax that Apple should be paying doesn't get paid is, it's got to come from somewhere else.
With the United States facing a record deficit, Barack Obama has unveiled a $3.7 trillion budget with spending cuts and tax hikes at its core.
We're going through the budget, program by program, item by item, line by line, looking for areas where we can save taxpayer dollars.
Meanwhile, the U.S. administration has announced significant budget cuts.
The agencies facing cuts, the Environmental Protection Agency, the State Department, the Agriculture Department, the Labor Department, Health and Human Services, and the list goes on and on.
In the long run, that's what's happening. All this revenue loss is coming out of something that we'd all really like to see, like structurally sound bridges and roads, a good education system, a healthcare system that we can all rely on. All of these important services are incrementally eroded by tax avoidance on this scale. Everybody loves their iPhones, and so it's easier for people to fall so in love with their iPhones that they don't really want to think about what else the company is doing. The responsibility for corporate tax avoidance by Apple and other companies can be laid at the feet of a compliant Congress, politely passing whatever bills the corporate lobbyists want them to pass. But part of it also has to do with the public. And we need to get to a place where voters care enough to find out whether the companies they're patronizing are really good citizens of the world.
Apple's corporate tax avoidance shows no sign of slowing, and the real-world implications of this are felt across the globe. This friendly company with innovation and care at its heart is using these loopholes to take the money away from its customers in the places it could truly make a difference.
It's funny, I remember when I moved here, I actually thought I was going to sort of cover the downfall of Apple. And like a lot of people, I figured, the iPhone was pretty saturated, right? Anyone who wanted a smartphone had one at that point. And it wasn't clear to me how Apple was going to continue to eke out profits. And of course, they basically doubled in valuation since then. And I realized that all the assumptions I had were just, totally backwards. The power of the ecosystem is really just beginning to be understood, I think.
Which smartphone is in your pocket right now?
Got the iPhone 10.
Oh, there it is.
There it is.
Sometimes it's hard to break away from that ecosystem. What is it about this ecosystem you're talking about? Judner, you're next, man. The pressure's on.
iPhone 10.
Wow, it's just 2 phones so far.
I'm gonna be straight up. It's iMessage, man, in the ecosystem.
Whoa.
That's what it is for me.
The Apple ecosystem describes the way that different Apple products integrate seamlessly with each other. With Messages, for example, Apple uses the internet rather than cell towers and is able to display messages across your Apple Watch, MacBook, and iPhone with no delay. The more that you buy into the company, the more you are led into this ecosystem.
The Apple ecosystem is designed in a way that everything must go through Apple. Now, whether it's apps, whether it's services, or even the way that currency is transferred through Apple devices, Apple potentially takes a cut from everything that happens. When you think about apps that you buy on the App Store and you may be paying $2 or $3 for that application, not all of that goes to the developer. Apple takes a piece of the pie along the way. This comes from music, this comes from their iBook store. In every facet of Apple, there is something that they do capture along the way. What Apple has done very well, to their credit, is that they're holding suppliers within that agreement, within that ecosystem.
Apple knows that it has a captive audience in its ecosystem. So if the new iPhone doesn't feature that many improvements, it's hard luck because you're going to buy it anyway. If you don't like the fact that the MacBook Pro has fewer ports than it did years ago, it's tough luck because you're going to buy one anyway.
You could be sort of happily locked in a sense, right? I mean, it's nice when your Apple products work seamlessly together. The trouble is some of the antitrust implications there, wherein, if I want to use a smartwatch that's not Apple, it doesn't work as seamlessly with Apple. And it's not just because they're different systems, it's that Apple actively makes it difficult for other products that aren't Apple to work with the iPhone.
Today we're announcing Apple Music, the next chapter in music, and I know you are going to love it. It will change the way that you experience music forever.
Apple's both the gatekeeper to its ecosystem, and it makes products for that ecosystem, right? So Spotify has complained for years that, Spotify has to pay 30% of fees to Apple when someone signs up through the iPhone, and then Apple comes along, basically takes Spotify's idea of streaming music platform, introduces its own, gives it a higher ranking in the App Store, calls it music. So there's lots of instances like that where Apple is a competitor and a gatekeeper to the App Store. And there's a conflict of interest there that just favors Apple to some extent ever so slightly, and to some extent in a way that can feel existential if you're a developer.
Thank you for the opportunity to offer testimony. At Apple, we make ourselves a promise. As Steve put it, we only make things that we'd recommend to our family and friends. You can try to define this difference in a lot of ways. You can call it the seamless integration of hardware and software. You can call it simplicity of design or a great ecosystem. All of those things are true. But if you want to put it simply, products like iPhone just work.
Let me ask you this. Apple requires all app developers to use Apple's payment processing system if those developers want to sell their goods or services to Apple users through Apple's App Store. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, because it's
by processing payments for apps that you allow into the App Store, you collect their customer data and you use that data to inform Apple as to whether or not it would be profitable for Apple to launch a competing app. Isn't that correct?
Apple has come under massive fire for antitrust. That's been one of the big battles that the company has been fighting over the last few years. It really is felt, reporting on Apple, that there has been a new antitrust case every day in a different region. South Korea, Italy, America, the UK, you see it everywhere, that they are all going for different areas. But the big thing is the App Store, because the argument is that the App Store is controlled by Apple. Not only does Apple take up to 30% of every purchase on the App Store, but it also controls which apps are allowed to even be there, which has led to the argument that they serve as a gatekeeper for the platform.
And European Union regulators have accused Apple of violating the bloc's antitrust laws.
Yeah, I think that it's a bold move. I think that at the end of the day, antitrust scrutiny on Apple is increasing.
Yeah, that's right. You've been called one of the most important trials in Apple's history, with the game maker accusing the tech giant of violating antitrust law.
In a sort of layperson sense of, if I want to download an app onto my phone, how do I do it? There is only one answer, right? And it's the App Store. And I think we've become so, normalized by that being the case. And, it's clearly about Apple taking a 15 to 30% cut. Where Apple can really make money is a proliferation of services. And services mostly are done by third parties. And so the more and more of those apps that there are, the more and more revenue that Apple's able to make. And again, you can just find all kinds of apps. I looked up photo editing app today and I found one that was all about body image. So you take a picture of yourself and then you can slim away the fat and make yourself look better and everything. It's certainly something that Apple would say, we're against that sort of thing. And yet there it is on the App Store. It's been approved, it costs money, and Apple's taking a cut. You have to remember that the average smartphone user is on their phone more than a quarter of the day. So if you're Apple, there's just an unprecedented level of power in terms of how someone engages with your product, right? Compare that to a BMW that someone might spend, $70,000 or $80,000 on. Well, they drive it an hour a day, right? BMW sort of doesn't have a hold on your life in a certain sense, nor can they dictate the speed limits or anything like that. There's a sort of limit to how they can actually please you as a customer. Whereas when you're a smartphone operating system and the device maker and the gatekeeper and you're controlling apps, that's a lot of power.
As Apple's device offering expands, so does its control over its users, and the law is slow to catch up. With so many people's lives relying on Apple products, it's clear that the power this company has is entirely unprecedented. Over the last few years, technology has enveloped the entirety of human life. All of the information about someone's career, health, and relationships is now stored on their phone, and the security of that phone is fundamental to the human right to privacy.
Someone once said to me about Apple that at one point they were like a cute kitten, adorable, and this was a small company. We're thinking back in the 90s when Apple was fighting against Microsoft. But as they've grown bigger, they're like a tiger, something that is much more dangerous and also maybe cute, but it's still, you need to have a healthy respect around a tiger. And I think as Apple has grown bigger, it has gotten some enormous power. It is the largest company in the world.
It's being called a regressive step for privacy by critics. Apple plans to enable a feature that will scan iPhones, iPads, and Mac computers for illegal content.
Apple plan to scan iPhone images raises fears over bulk surveillance.
Apple plans to unveil new iPhone software designed to identify images of child pornography from just about every phone they've manufactured.
This is a big sea change for Apple because it had been the what happens on your phone stays on your phone company. They had been promoting privacy and security as being their main differentiators with other competitors. And this was endangering this notion that it was your phone. Now, the biggest danger of this is that they may face pressure to go beyond the child sexual abuse material that is the initial focus of this, because so many countries out there want to scan for more. They want to scan for anything that could be dangerous to their regimes. And we've seen this in a number of countries where they have laws on the books saying that companies have to find and eliminate things they don't like.
The Kremlin says that many of those involved in protest against the jailing of opposition politician Alexei Navalny are hooligans and provocateurs.
In September 2021, both Apple and Google were pressured by the Russian government to remove certain apps from their app stores. These apps were from opposition parties, offering advice on how to best vote to remove Putin. Apple and Google both complied.
Well, if a local law says, well, you got the scanning mechanism and we need you to expand what you're scanning about, then Apple's going to have to face a choice about whether it wants to continue doing business in that market or whether it's going to comply with that law and potentially be engaged in a massive, authoritarian censorship scheme.
I think Apple has grown to be such a behemoth on this planet that they do certainly think that they are above the law in some cases, or even above ethics. I think what you'll tend to find with Apple is that they're certainly keen on making sure that privacy is more of a marketing tool than potentially doing good for the world. There is that arrogance, there is that perception that they would rather make sure that consumers strongly believe that their privacy is safe with them than actually helping people when they need it.
Aside from the products that have come out this year, like the iPhone 13, the major theme of Apple this year has really been privacy. And privacy has been at the forefront of what Apple's been doing for several years. But they really have been marketing it a lot, right? They've used the Las Vegas slogan, but for Apple in the past, right? What happens on your phone stays on your phone. And they have a particular ad, and they sort of personify how people track you as you use your phone. So as he gets into a taxi, for instance, somebody else gets in with him and follows him around. So by the time he gets to the end of his day at his apartment, 20 people are in his apartment or whatever. And then he gets on his iPhone and he clicks a button that says, ask apps not to track. And they all go poof. And the idea is that, of course, your privacy has been maintained because Apple's given you this feature. But in a sense, you can tell that it's not going to be as anything like that in the digital experience just by the nature of the words that they use, right? So if it was that simple, it would be, do you want to enable tracking, yes or no? But actually, the answers are ask app not to track, right? Not don't track or, not allowed to track, but ask the app not to track. And so far, since Apple's introduced this policy, developers basically tell me, they really haven't done anything. So you're still being tracked by a whole host of digital ads companies, by obscure data brokers that you've never heard of, that are doing everything that basically Apple was saying was bad in the commercial, but they're giving you the illusion that they've solved this problem by pressing this button. And you can actually argue that that's sort of a worse situation to be in, because by pressing the button, you assume that you have security, but when in fact you actually don't. Whereas, if someone's using an Android phone where you basically don't have the sort of luxury of thinking that you're living in this privacy-centric world, you might be a little more weary of the websites you're using and how you're, interacting with your apps or whatever, because you sort of know, hey, this is a bit of a dangerous town, don't leave your money, on the floor or whatever, right? Keep things close to you. So They've given you this understanding that things are really private, but in actuality, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that they are.
iPhone 10, your iPhone is locked until you look at it and it recognizes you. Nothing has ever been simpler, more natural, and effortless. We call this Face ID. Every time you glance at your iPhone 10, it detects your face with the flood illuminator, even in the dark. The IR camera takes an IR image. The dot projector projects out over 30,000 invisible IR dots. We use the IR image and the dot pattern, and we push them through neural networks to create a mathematical model of your face.
Face ID on the phone, if it's using it just for verification purposes and the information never leaves the phone, then it doesn't have very strong implications. However, if the information used for facial recognition that is developed by an iPhone over the years is transferred elsewhere such that now your face can be readily identified in all sorts of other contexts while you're in the crowd, right? This has tremendous implications for our lives. And so putting that in the control of the user can help protect against the danger of the company turning bad later.
For many years, there was a myth in the technology community that when a new iPhone was released, older iPhones would get slower. Users theorized that this deliberate ploy would trick people into buying a new device they didn't need. Whilst this had been suspected for a long time, benchmark tests in 2017 proved it was in fact true, and that Apple intentionally slowed down their older phones.
I'm so sour on Apple because of what they did with the batteries.
Yeah.
That was such a dirty thing to me because everybody had always suspected, like my friend Brian was always like, dude, I'm telling you, when the new phones come out, your old phone starts moving slower. I'm like, dude,
Yeah.
that's a conspiracy. That's all. But then when I found out that it was real, I was like, you.
The problem was the way they didn't tell people. Like, they could have just avoided like the whole PR, whatever you want to call it, by just telling people, look, this is what we do when your phone's getting older. We need to preserve either the CPU or the battery. They didn't tell us until people started suspecting things and they had to make a statement. And then it looked kind of dirty and like hidden.
I don't buy it.
Yeah.
I think it's a trick to try to get you to buy new phones. I don't.
There's no way they didn't think about that.
Yeah, of course
There's
they
no
thought
chance
about
they didn't
it.
think about that.
We'll focus now on a sneaky strategy used by some manufacturers to keep consumers buying electronics. It's called planned obsolescence.
On a eu un problème avec plusieurs iPhones qui ont été victimes d'une mise à jour qui a été demandée, voire harcelée par Apple pour l'implémenter, sachant que cette mise à jour allait ralentir les fonctionnalités du téléphone. Par exemple, je me souviens que des témoignages comme quoi le clavier ne fonctionnait plus ou les applications étaient très lentes ou ne s'ouvraient plus. Donc le téléphone était quasi inutilisable. Et justement à ce moment-là, il y avait un nouvel iPhone qui sortait. Donc c'est vraiment ce sujet qu'on a mis devant de la table et qu'on a proposé au procureur de la République en France de juger pour obsolescence programmée ou au moins pratique commerciale trompeuse.
Following this court ruling, Apple was fined more than $27 million for the intentional slowing down of older iPhones.
Je crois que la sanction financière qu'il y a eu en France, elle est quand même importante, mais elle n'est pas suffisante au regard du géant d'Apple. Bon, cette sanction a été appliquée dans d'autres pays. Donc une fois cumulée, ça commence à faire beaucoup d'argent. C'est sûr que quand on touche au business model ou en tout cas à la rentabilité d'une entreprise, c'est un bon moyen de les influencer. Mais certainement, ce n'est pas suffisant parce on peut sûrement encore plus d'argent avec ce modèle qui ressemble à de l'obsolescence planifiée.
A fundamental part of Apple's business model relies on its customers buying new devices. So, to an extent, this planned obsolescence is unavoidable.
There is a coming storm with this because it doesn't fit with Apple's current philosophy of trying to limit its impact on the environment, trying to reach net zero by 2030.
I think it's important to make products repairable and to give customers a way to do things with their products or modify them, but it goes against the Apple credo, which is we control the experience. So if we control the experience, we don't want you to take your Apple product someplace else. The problem with the Apple credo is that it's, well, paternalistic to the extreme. Okay, you can't do this because it will ruin your experience. No one else can do it except us.
In the
the old days, when something broke, we fixed it. These days, it's more like we're in a fix. Today's gadgets are either designed to be unfixable by the average person or by anyone at all.
For years, Apple have made their devices intentionally difficult to fix, citing safety concerns and the need to protect trade secrets. However, recent years have seen a growing discontent over Apple's stubbornness, culminating in a whole host of potential new legislation on the verge of being passed around the world.
I'd now like to go to House Bill 1124, Delegate Feldmark.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, committee members. For the record, I'm Delegate Jessica Feldmark. I'm pleased to be here to present House Bill 1124. House Bill 1124, Right to Repair, would allow consumers to exercise the full rights of ownership over the products they purchase, including the right to repair those products.
I am Emily Ranson with Clean Water Action, and we have submitted testimony that many other environmental groups have signed on as well. If Marylanders were able to hold on to our phones for just one more year on average, it would reduce the climate pollution equivalent to taking 11,000 cars off the road.
On the one hand, Apple is talking about what a wonderfully environmentally great company they are, and they've got their fancy new spaceship campus with solar panels on the roof. On the other hand, manufacturing these products is incredibly environmentally destructive. It's a huge amount of fresh water that's destroyed in the process of making these phones. It's a large amount of carbon that's emitted in the atmosphere. It is an incredibly resource-intensive process to manufacture a new phone. So far and away, the environmental imperative is if we have manufactured something, we should use it for as long as possible. We need to get the maximum utility out of it. And so Apple, on the one hand, is saying, we're this very green company. On the other hand, they're doing everything they can to artificially shorten the lifespans of their products. Apple is making the best decision for themselves, and they're making a decision assuming a kind of low level of competence and intelligence across the population. Of course, you can't put a new battery in yourself. If you're not smart enough, you're not competent enough, you might hurt yourself. Apple is not looking out for us, they're looking out for themselves.
Hello, my name is Sam Bensimer. I'm 16 years old. I'm a junior in high school. I have run an electronics repair business in Washington, D.C. since I was 12. I actually have a quote here from Apple that they responded to this saying, it's unsafe for people other than Apple authorized service providers to replace their batteries. I've been replacing batteries in iPhones since I was 12. I'm still here today. Got an iPhone right here. You can just pull there's some screws in here. You take the screen off, you pull some tabs out, and the battery comes out. I don't see how that's unsafe.
I'm trying to see now, I'm almost thinking this bill's getting bigger than what we're talking about now. About, customer repair. Like, this is almost like going after a business model that Apple has set in place. If you want to buy an iPhone, you want their technology they have, then you're going to have to use compatible Apple earbuds, compatible charging stuff. But that's their business model, what they set in place.
The strategies Apple has employed to keep its customers buying devices have been replicated by technology companies across the world, but it's not the phones that have an expiration date, it's the batteries within the phones.
Well, imagine if we had to do this with cars. If when the tires on your car wore out, it was, well, I guess it's time to go and buy a new one. None of us would put up with that, but we do with a phone. And I mean, the battery in your phone lasts 18 months to 2 years tops, and then you need a new battery. We should be replacing our batteries 3 times before we replace our phones, but that's nowhere in the user manual for an iPhone. Instead, it's, hey, yeah, maybe yours is old and slow, but look at the shiny new one that we've got. Well, it's slow because the battery's degraded. Throw a new battery in and it'll be good as new. If we're going to solve climate change, if we're going to reduce the overall amount of CO2 that we put into the atmosphere every year, we're going to have to address the root of the problem, which is consumption. We have to reduce how much we consume. Unless we address that root problem of consumption, we're not going to be able to fix all of these second order effects. We've been trained. I mean, this has been, systematic consumer brainwashing. Every year there's a new one. It's the iPhone 10, 11, 12. Oh, mine isn't as cool because I don't have the fancy new camera. Consumers are starting to see the writing is on the wall, and hopefully that will slow down the money spigot a little bit.
The right to repair movement has been sweeping the world, and new laws are close to passing in dozens of countries. But this movement poses a huge threat to Apple's business model, and Apple's influence in governments is still significant.
The Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee of your Washington State Senate in our constitutional republic, come to order. Okay, great. We're going to begin with the public hearing on Senate Bill 5799.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I am Charlie Brown. I'm here today on behalf of the Consumer Technology Association. We are opposed to Senate Bill 5799. We don't believe that the legislature should pass this legislation without considering the unintended consequences. I'm sure that all of you have heard about lithium-ion batteries and the potential problems that can cause when they are not connected properly to a device. I have to say that at this point, with the language that's in this legislation, we absolutely oppose this bill.
Senator Stanford.
Why do I have to get a super special screwdriver in order to do that? I think that's really the focus here. It's not about being able to get into every little electronic component in this thing. It's about being able to fix a USB port or a worn piece of rubber. So could you talk about that?
We recognize that this is an issue that many members of this body are concerned about, but at this point, this is not something that we think that this committee nor the legislature should move.
I'm trying to understand your issue because I'm kind of with these guys. I'd much rather, I got 3 layers with my car. I thought the car example was excellent. I can take it to the dealership and get it fixed. I can take it to my non-dealer repair shop who's certified, or I can take it to my neighbor Eddie and have him fix it, right? So I have all 3 layers that I can go through with my automobile and I can make the decision that's best for me. So unless you guys can show like a real risk to copyright infringement and digital theft, privacy, those types of things, I don't really understand why we wouldn't let everybody have a crack at fixing my phone when it breaks. That's the part. I do understand if you can prove a real threat to your intellectual property.
I'll just briefly address this. Thank you for that, Senator. I do want to say our products that my technology companies are working on are meticulously designed, and they are using the highest caliber parts. And I would love to follow up with you.
Do I own this phone? I mean, it sounds like when I buy it, my intention, my understanding was I pay you money, it's now mine. But it sounds like there's some lasting commitment where, am I renting it from the company? Like, why do I have some obligation back to you? How is this relationship different than when I buy other products in the marketplace?
There are some.
So let me just interrupt you there. We need to wrap up this panel. We need to move along. But I do encourage, I hope you can hear that there's a lot of support for this broad issue. With that, concludes our public hearing on Senate Bill 5799.
You have the most profitable corporation in history of humanity. And you've got a lot of lawsuits that have been successfully chipping away at it, but they're not stopping the juggernaut. The only way that we're going to see systemic change, the only way we're going to see Apple's behavior change is if we get laws passed that force them to change. And Apple has lawyers at every step of the democratic process working to preserve this juggernaut of obsolescence that they've built. And so trying to dismantle that systematically has been very challenging. It's taken us a long time to get to where we're at, where we have legislation just about ready to pass. And I'm optimistic, but I also am realistic about the amount of money that is arrayed against us.
In 2010, news broke of suicides at one of Apple's largest factories.
My name is Li Qiang. I'm the executive director of China Labor Watch. I didn't know much about Apple until the Foxconn suicides happened in 2009. One of the serious problems with Apple is that it pushes the workers to their limits. Apple uses a hunger marketing strategy that is actually a torture for workers. Their marketing usually starts in September, which needs a lot of production, and it goes till November, 3 months in total.
There were reports of people forced into working 20-hour days, chemicals being used that caused irreparable damage, and grueling conditions for those working the assembly lines in these Apple factories.
It needs a lot of workers, and they have to work overtime to complete it. Whereas in the off-season, from December to June of the following year, it has the factories fire a lot of workers, so many workers lose their jobs. This is how it goes. So the workers are under great pressure. During peak season, they work 11 to 12 hours every day, 7 days a week. A lot of workers are not allowed to ask for leave. If they can't get a day off, some worker death cases show that some died of a cold, or inflammation, or common sickness. I think all the factories of Apple's supply chain are using forced labor like Foxconn and GNDC. This forces the workers to continue working in the factory, otherwise they are not paid at all. And of course, Apple benefits from it. When Apple is rushing orders, that is when consumers like you and me are going crazy to buy Apple products in a short period of time, and it's the workers that have to pay the price for it. The workers are forced to work in factories instead of getting their wages.
I think it is something that consumers should be more aware of, simply because I think, in a sense, we're all in the plague pit with it. Everyone's hands are dirty, so there's no escape from it.
I don't think Apple has done anything. They just do a lot of PR instead of supporting the workers. But they are fully aware, as are the investors who are profiting from this process. I feel very bad that Apple, acting as a prestigious company, is lying all the time. Apple's lies are terrible. But what's worse is they distort facts that are clearly true for their own profit.
Although Western consumers like to think that they are morally virtuous in some areas, you need only really look at some of the conditions in these factories that are being paid for out of our pockets to know that we're perhaps not as virtuous as we think we are.
It actually gives the workers a very bad impression. As we all know, Apple is an American company which calls for human rights. But quite a lot of its workers in China are college students and the young generation. They have worked at the factories of Apple's supply chains, and they are hostile to the Western world. Why is that? Because companies like Apple mistreat them in factories in China. So, although Apple's impact on Sino-US relations is indirect, it has responsibility for it, and a lot of consumers are not aware of that.
So it's to some extent something that they can't get away with. The toxicity of so many of our supply chains across so many areas is so bad that it's an issue that will not be fixed through boycotts.
Basically, there's nothing or very little the consumers can do. So I don't think the consumers should take the responsibility, but the US government or the Western governments should do. Only those governments have the power to force Apple to change. Without any outside intervention, Apple would not change anything because it is a profit-oriented company.
Apple's labor record continues to cause concern for human rights investigators on the ground in China. So why isn't this still making headlines? The cult of Apple has been talked about for years. Millions of fanatics around the world revere this company and praise its every move. They religiously defend the company on social media and purchase every device that they come out with. And this is no accident.
Apple has been quite astute at understanding early that there is something that we might call religious about the way we use technology. And it's almost baffling that other companies didn't work that way, right? Like we don't think about like a PC with that sensibility of like awe and delight, you know, that we're gonna open it and it's just gonna pop on and we're gonna feel feelings. We don't even expect it. And I think one of the things that Apple did really early and consistently was understand that that was a space you could aim for and feed it, right? Sometimes quite explicitly through like Apple evangelists who would work on college campuses to talk about the iMac or something.
If Apple signed up today as a religion, they've already got their Mecca in Cupertino, which does look a little bit creepy in some ways, and all of their stores are their small churches. We know that when it comes to an iPhone launch day, especially in the past when people actually used to queue up for iPhones, they used to camp for days. People used to camp around their stores, living on the streets, just to make sure they could be the first ones to get their hands on an iPhone. Leading up to that countdown of those doors opening, Apple staff would line up and surround the entire store and almost start chanting and clapping in this rhythmic way that made you feel like maybe you were walking into a bit of a cult. And you transferred over that money and you bought a device and suddenly you felt like, am I actually paying for this? The experience is too good to be true. I've paid over $1,000, but I feel so welcomed here.
Apple stores are famed for the way they christen people into their Apple family and are heavily trademarked for their layout. The tall ceilings, white walls, and open plan design are synonymous with the Apple brand.
That kind of design is something much closer to the feeling of being inside of like a community worship center or a large church of the late 20th century than it is your ordinary big box store, right? This is a little bit of what heaven's supposed to feel like.
Typical joke is that Apple could sell milk, and of course they would sell milk at with a huge overpriced, overcommon milk, and when you see customers lining up to buy that milk, they will, hey, why are you lining up to buy milk? It's, after all, it's milk. And they would say, no, it's milk, but it's white. You have this company that is able to exert this distorting light, and when they get a new product, you don't feel that you're buying a product. You're becoming part of something. You are enhancing your image. And that's amazingly powerful.
People buy it because it says something about them. It's a status symbol as much as it signals your merit and your appeal to other people.
I would say this is a bit of a parable for the 21st century and the way that we're going to have to think about planetary crisis. That there's a kind of parable of the clean, the smooth, the seamless that we call ecosystem that's designed precisely in a way that distracts us from what's happening on ecosystems. You know, like it's not lost that you can open an Apple and the first thing you'll see is some beautiful natural landscape as your desktop. And that these things are named after great landscapes in California that are increasingly experiencing pressure from climate change and wildfire. So we have to read these ironies together and maybe think about why, as much as it's important to look at the religious aspects of technology, it's important to ask ourselves, is ecosystem still the word we want to use to describe a successful technology that's able to bring a bunch of devices together? Like maybe that's not smart.
We wanted to make sure that we send a clear message to Apple and then also to the folks who are out on the line so they know more about the company that they're supporting today. And I'm a loyal Apple customer. I own an iPhone, I own a MacBook, and I love Apple products. But I also want to make sure that the folks who make the products that I love so much are treated ethically.
Do we want to build a world where any corporation has so much share of resources in the world and so little scrutiny? I don't think that's sustainable for us. So the kinds of reframing it's going to take to push back, it's going to have to really come from a more public reframing of what kinds of other values we insist upon as a way of creating a whole ecological solution for a shared planetary future. Who do you belong to and who do we choose to belong to?
As an uncertain future looms, the power is in the hands of the consumer to demand more from the companies we give our lives to.